Another thing that's different is the reach of these influence operations, notwithstanding the fact that they're making use of AI tools to generate better content, more polished content. Their reach is nowhere close to where it was a few years ago.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Scott R. Anderson, senior editor here at Lawfare, with returning guest Alex Iftimie, who's now a deputy general counsel at OpenAI.
Our platforms are not the ones where this content is going to be distributed and liked and shared further with other third parties. And so we have to be able to collaborate with those kinds of content distributors to disrupt these networks before they reach a critical mass of followers.
Today, we're talking about OpenAI's recent report revealing that it has shut down several state-backed information operations using its technology, and what it tells us about how artificial intelligence is changing this challenging policy landscape. So, Alex, last week, OpenAI released a pretty interesting report, a document that got a lot of media pickup, has a lot of people paying attention to an issue that I think we all knew was going to come to the fore at some point, but I think has now really burst its way into the public attention, in part because of the writing OpenAI has done on it. And that is the use of AI in a number of influence operations by foreign governments that OpenAI has been involved in kind of shutting down at this point. Tell us a little bit about this report and why it's coming forth at this point. You note in the report that you have 5 case studies that represent influence operations you all have shut down, I think, over the last 3 or 4 months or so. So why is the report being published now, and what is its sort of role in the strategy OpenAI is pursuing for how to address these sorts of threats and misuses of the technology it's providing?
First, it's really nice to be back to the Lawfare podcast in a slightly different role, and glad to be talking about this topic in particular. What I would start by saying is our goal is to build tools that better people's lives and that people want to engage with. And we recognize that bad actors are also out there who are trying to abuse our tools to harm others. And information operations are one of those use cases. It's one that has been speculated about for many years, that threat actors might use AI models to influence audiences in various different ways. And we wanted to offer our perspective on that based on our visibility into the ecosystem and our ability to look into how these actors are actually using a tool like ChatGPT and our API. And this is OpenAI's first report on information operations. I certainly don't think it will be the last. And as far as I'm aware, this is actually the first report of its kind by any AI lab. And why do it? I think the main reason is that we think it's important to expose this kind of activity. Transparency around influence operations matters because it helps to inoculate the public to what is coming. As we think about the challenge of AI, it's important to be able to demystify what it is, how it's used, and to make it easier for the public to identify the operations that we identified in this report and other AI abuse.
So the report really spends a lot of time digging deep into 5 case studies, which you describe as case studies, that reflect a range of activities and a range of international actors. You've got 2 Russian, 1 Chinese, 1 Iranian, 1 Israel, a real spectrum of different states out there that we know use different types of technology to pursue information operations on social media and other venues. No surprising actors there. I want to dig into those 5 case studies. Before we do, though, can you give us a sense about how representative these are in terms of the broader experience that OpenAI has with this type of operation? Are these 5 of 100? Or are these 5 of the kind of most prominent, notable ones that you all have tackled so far? How much of this is a small sampling of a much broader trend, or really an effort to document a big part of your experience so far as an organization?
I'd say it's the latter. There are ongoing investigations. I think we'll have more of these kinds of reports to publish in the future. But this is the kind of activity we're seeing. It's a good representation of it, and it reflects quite a bit of what we have seen. And as you say, they include some really well-known information operations, groups like Doppelganger and Spamouflage, as well as some less well-known ones, including what appears to be a commercial info ops for hire kind of operation out of Israel. And we think that the type of activity we've observed with respect to these actors also is a good representation of how groups could use AI technology to do these kinds of information operations, and they're also very much a representation of what we have seen on our platform. Things like generating comments to be posted on social media platforms, making up personas and crystallizing, or rather drafting comments in the style of a particular persona, conducting open source research, and also more mundane things like having help with scripting and debugging computer code that might be used to generate websites or script certain portions of these information operations.
So let's go through these different case studies, because I do think it's worth really digging into what they are using ChatGPT and the other services you all provide as part of these operations, which varies a little bit between the actors, between the objectives of the organizations. Let's start with the two Russian ones. These are Bad Grammar and Doppelganger, which are a little bit different. Tell us about what you all uncovered with these two groups, particularly what's new, what's interesting about some of these trends we're seeing versus other information operations, and maybe the unique role AI services and resources are playing in them.
Sure. Well, let me start before getting into what's new to mention a bit about what doesn't really appear to have changed, particularly with respect to the first of the two Russian groups we identified. One that we couldn't attribute, we haven't identified as a connection to past activity, and we have referred to it as Bad Grammar. The activities of the group look very similar to some of the operations you would expect from Internet Research Agency and other St. Petersburg style operations, where the actors sought to develop personas to write social media commentary in the style of those personas, to write comments on socially divisive issues, and to seek to sow discord and undermine confidence in democratic institutions. I think what's new and different is twofold. One, their focus in terms of substance has changed. One of the interesting things looking at the Russian groups in particular is how much of their content is now focused on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Much of the content seems geared at seeking to demobilize the Ukrainian public, to suggest that the United States and other allies shouldn't support Ukrainian counterparts. And so I think that is simply a reflection of what is front and center in terms of the geopolitical landscape that we're faced with today. Another thing that's different is the reach of these influence operations, notwithstanding the fact that they're making use of AI tools to generate better content, more polished content. Their reach is nowhere close to where it was a few years ago. We observed very little engagement with this content when we identified the content on third-party social media platforms. And I think this also reflects the fact that social media companies, other distributors of this kind of content, have gotten much better at identifying this kind of inauthentic behavior much earlier and taking action to disrupt these kinds of networks before they're able to reach a level of engagement that make these networks more effective at influencing public opinion.
So Badgrammer and Doppelganger are both interesting because they're both Russian-oriented and towards kind of conventional policy goals that are kind of familiar to Russian influence operations, Ukraine being a new axis for one. I thought the Spamouflage case was particularly interesting because a big target of that was, although not the exclusive one, was not just foreign states or foreign actors or foreign policy goals, but actually Chinese expats and efforts to engage them or frame their engagement on social media through other avenues, different ways. Tell us about what we saw China doing or what Chinese affiliated agents doing with ChatGPT, the unique ways they may have been able to use it to maximize the effect of this broader campaign.
I would say, I think you've largely covered the summary of the activity we observed, but Spamouflage is a longstanding information operation group. They've been exposed and disrupted any number of times before, not just by us, but by any number of other tech company peers. And, they are prolific, but not particularly effective. Some of their content comes off as clumsy and unpolished. And notwithstanding the fact that they sought to use AI models to generate some of that content, it really didn't change the operation of those groups or their reach. As you point out, some of the content sought to criticize Chinese dissidents. That's a practice that they are well known for. There were also efforts to persuade related to the Fukushima nuclear plant as a more recent theme related to the content, and also some content related to Tibet, as I recall. One of the ways in which AI models are used by these actors is to be able to translate content, to be able to post material not just in the language that the operators may be familiar with, but also to translate it into other languages. And I think that's one of the capabilities that we're monitoring very closely as we think about the types of safeguards we can put in place.
And for the two remaining groups, we have the International Union of Virtual Media. There's the Iran-backed group, which strikes me as doing activities that are very much in kind of similar to what we saw in the Badgrammer Russian context, kind of state promotion of viewpoints and things like that. So nothing particularly interesting there. But then the Zero Xeno case, the Israel one that you've already mentioned, as a kind of private for-hire enterprise strikes me as particularly interesting. And a particularly interesting case study from the perspective of OpenAI and the purveyor of ChatGPT, because of course, something that a new technology that rolls out, that a new capability it facilitates, is the ability to generate things potentially at scale that imitate or otherwise persuasively can be presented as somehow being organic or generated by individuals, a capability that may not have been as easy to achieve 5 or 10 years ago. Tell us a little about that group and how unique an outlier they are, what they were doing with ChatGPT that jumps out to you.
Scott, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that, as we think about the risk of misuse of our services, it very much focuses on making sure that we don't create capabilities that drastically alter the landscape. And one of those, of course, that we rightly should be concerned about is the risk that AI tools allow these actors to generate this kind of content on a totally different scale than existed before. And what I will say in the context of this last group, the company that goes by Stoic, is we really didn't see that kind of activity at scale. Certainly, some of the reason for that is limits of our input into our systems, but also we simply didn't see that kind of use. And if we did see that kind of use, it is something that would also stand out to our investigators. And so what I would say is the activities that occur at scale also are the ones that are, in some cases, easier to detect because they stick out in what is otherwise a large amount of or a disparate amount of use of our services. And that's part of the story with respect to this group. In many cases, we were able to identify the activity quite quickly and shut it down before they had the ability to convert it into the kind of reach that you'd be concerned about.
Well, that you've anticipated exactly my next question, which is, ChatGPT and most services you all provide have not been widely available very long, but we're in the approaching the 2-year mark ish, if I recall correctly. Do you have a sense about your toolkit for identifying these trends and these uses? What is the confidence interval about being able to identify them at an early enough phase? And how quickly were you able to stop some of these services once the actors actually started using these for these, problematic purposes? I didn't get a sense of that from the report, and I don't know if that's something that you're in a position to share, but I'd be curious as to say, what is the response window that we're dealing with here?
Well, I would say a couple points on that. One is that, the same AI tools that these actors are using to try to enhance their influence operations are also tools that make our investigators a whole lot better. We have the ability to investigate this kind of content in a whole bunch of languages, activities that would have taken weeks or months to do manually in a matter of minutes and hours. And so I think we as investigators and as defenders of these platforms are able to rely on some of these tools to just do things we couldn't do to disrupt this kind of activity. There's also a presumption in there that I want to, or I should say an assumption in there that I want to challenge just slightly, which is there are also defensive design features of the platforms that create friction for these threat actors as they try to use our platforms, refusals, rate limits, other ways in which we are able to limit some of the scope of this activity. Can I make a promise that we catch all of these things immediately? Certainly, that's not the case. But I do think we are getting better by the months, weeks, days that we do these kinds of investigations and are focused on disrupting this kind of activity.
So the defensive measures you note is a really interesting inclusion in the report. It's something that you all give equal space and credence to, alongside an analysis of the attacker tools, like the ways ChatGPT and other services are being used for attackers and these influence operations, the perpetrators of the influence operations. You really highlight some of these ways and barriers that are being put in place. And I suspect that is an area where there's always more options for growth and adaptation as users and perpetrators adapt. Tell us a little bit about these defensive tools. Where did we see friction points for these sorts of state-backed actors? And maybe are there hints at places where there might be additional friction or space for friction in the future? What did we learn and did we see reflected in the defensive measures sort of discussion in this report as really telling us the design features that make these things more difficult?
I think I covered a little bit about some of those defensive features just a minute ago, both in terms of refusals of our models to do certain things. For example, some of these actors wanted to create images of politicians. Those kinds of requests were refused by the models. And so a lot of the content that was generated in this case was text that the actors could well have created themselves, sitting in front of a keyboard. But more broadly, I think it's important to take a step back and maybe talk about how we approach our safety deployment. And it comes from a view that it is helpful to deploy our tools iteratively, to be able to launch to a small audience, to be able to test their use, to understand what works and what doesn't, and to be able to constantly improve the tools. And so, to your reference that ChatGPT was released, about 2 years ago now, the reality is that the ChatGPT that was released then is very different from the one that users engage with today. And that's not just because we have evolved our models and enhanced the way the tools operate. But that's also true from a safety perspective, which is to say, when we identify abuses, when we conduct the kinds of investigations that led to the report that we announced last week, we're not just publishing those results for the sake of publishing the results, but we are also taking the lessons of what we are seeing in real life and how these tools are being used to inform the safety systems that we have in place. And so there's a feedback loop between these kinds of investigations that identify the real world cases and activity and our safety systems teams who are thinking about how to create defensive tools and fine tune those defensive tools to prevent this kind of activity from occurring in the first place. And I want to be careful about getting into too many specifics about how exactly we do that, because the reality is we also don't want to tip off the bad actors into how some of those defensive measures work.
So another really fascinating point you make about, if I recall correctly, I think all 5 of these case studies is that they really, by your account in the report or OpenAI's account in the report, did not get much traction. I think you rated a 2 out of the 1 to 6 scale. I forget where the scale comes from exactly, but a kind of accepted industry scale in evaluating influence operations. 2 basically meaning they got some local pickup, but not really broader amplification to a lot of other places. I'm curious as to how exactly you all are going about measuring that and how big a factor that is in your own internal engagement in terms of investigation and or enforcement. Is this a measure that is evaluated using social media engagement? Is it something that, to the extent you can talk about it, you're engaging collaboratively with social media platforms? It just is a very interesting metric for you all to be evaluating and incorporating in. I'm wondering how much of that is an observation included in the report, and how much of it is a variable that's relevant to your strategic approach to these sorts of actors and this sort of conduct?
That's a good question. I guess I would say it is a helpful barometer, something that is important for people to understand as they think about how to, how these tools are used, the impact that these tools are having on these influence operations, and just generally good to have a taxonomy around the impact of influence operations. I don't know that it really changes our strategic thinking about whether this activity is a violation of our usage policy or should be disrupted. But I do think it's helpful in understanding what the real world impact is of the deployment of these kinds of tools and their use by bad actors. The scale we referenced, this breakout scale, is one that was published by Brookings some years ago, and it divides the impact of these kinds of influence operations into 6 categories, a 1 to 6 scale, where what the amount of reach that the information has received is basically determines where on the scale the activity falls. And so a 1 would be activity that is limited to one platform, receives little engagement. A 2, which is what some of the operations were in this case. All of them were either at 2 or at level 1. A 2 is where the content existed on multiple platforms but still had limited engagement, and it goes up from there. And so that assessment ultimately is based off of our visibility into where this content was distributed on social media platforms. And certainly it's not a scientific look at the dissemination, but I think really valuable context as we think about the reach of these groups.
So the main sanction, at least from the report, it looks like that was applied to these actors, is removal of their accounts that were engaged in these sorts of activities, presumably. At least that's what I gather from the report, although possibly I missed something. How does OpenAI approach the question of identifying and engaging in actors, particularly because, at least for a lot of its services like ChatGPT, they're pretty broadly publicly available? So it's not hard to imagine a bad actor starting up a new account, covering their tracks and taking other things that would under certain circumstances could make it easier to re-engage and require these sorts of services. So how do you approach that sort of sanctions, punishment, and restriction framework? And is there any consideration given to barriers to entry about how broadly publicly available certain services are made? Is there a case to be made that some need to be more restricted or otherwise tied to other verifiers or credentials that make it harder for bad actors to simply re-enter the game with a new account, with a new set of contact information and get the same thing? Or do you all have tools in place that prevent that from happening?
It's a great question. And the answer is we do have some ways to monitor for recidivism. And in some cases, we saw actors try to come back and we shut them down again. And there's no doubt that part of these kinds of investigative efforts becomes a bit of a whack-a-mole practice of identifying the recidivist behavior and trying to track it down. The technical measures to prevent that kind of recidivism are they're not perfect. But what I will also say is that doesn't mean that these kinds of disruptions are not a win, and that's for several reasons. First of all, being able to burn down these actors' infrastructure and identifying the content to peer companies and allowing them to shut down accounts before they are able to generate a following and to develop an ecosystem in which they can share that kind of content. That's really important. And I mentioned this at the outset. I think one of the things that has really changed and given the defenders an advantage in some of these information operation disruptions is the fact that we are better at catching them sooner before they are able to develop a wide audience that they're able to speak to. And so if we can identify these kinds of accounts, if we can share information about them to the content distributors, the social media companies where this content is ultimately spreading, and giving them the tools to be able to shut down these accounts, that goes a long way. And I also want to be clear, that goes in both directions. Many of our investigations were prompted by the work of third parties, whether it be social media companies or groups like Graphica or DFR Lab. There is a lot of cross-pollination in both directions in terms of identifying these actor sets, and that makes us all better at being able to shut down this activity more quickly. And the last point on that is, as we investigate these groups, it allows us to build in better safety mitigations to prevent some of their activity from happening in the first place. And that's a piece of the puzzle as well. Once we see certain activity, to the extent that we can identify it, distinguish it from legitimate activity, we also can put in barriers to make it harder for those actors to try to get the kind of content that they would want our models to generate.
So there's a very good case to be made that influence operations, because of what OpenAI services do, because of our historical and political moment heading into 2024 elections in the United States, state of democracy worldwide, et cetera, et cetera. There's a very good reason why influence operations be very high at the top of the list of potentially bad behavior OpenAI would want to look out for. But I'm curious as to how much this investigatory model also applies in other areas. You know, your usage policies, if you look at them, are very clearly concerned about certain things. Child sexual abuse material being probably the most explicitly identified. Another area being uses for criminal purposes, fraud, general misinformation for other contexts. And then there are other issues that come up a lot in the social media context, particularly came up a lot 5 or 10 years ago, that aren't as expressly addressed in the usage policies, but you can see them when you talk about things like hateful material. So the use of OpenAI services by hate groups or terrorism groups, right? That's a big perennial issue for social media companies. And you could see similar applications for some of this technology for those groups. So how much does this investigatory model extend to those other sorts of behaviors? Obviously, there are differences, and there will be differences in how any rational company would have to approach it. But I'm curious, are we going to see reports like this for those other sort of groups of bad behavior? And can you give us a sense about how they're being prioritized or how they're seen as priorities by OpenAI as they try and work on this with what are no doubt substantial, but nonetheless limited resources? How do you kind of arbitrage and decide what you tackle and how you tackle it?
There's no doubt that we have to prioritize. There's a lot that we try to do in identifying problematic content across the board. We've built out classifiers that allow us to pinpoint everything from CSAM content to other harmful content, whether it be harassment or violent content or other things like that. And we continue to iterate on those kinds of things. I will say certainly child safety, certainly state actor activity, whether it be malicious cyber activities or these kinds of influence operations, risks around the elections. They have, I think, for very good reason, been areas of focus for the company. I certainly wouldn't say they're the only focuses for the company, and we've taken a pretty broad view around the type of content we're focused on. Our investigative work starts with our usage policies, and a core pillar of those is to disallow the use of our services to harm others. And that, as you mentioned, includes everything from defrauding people to harassment to misleading content. And there are efforts to manufacture digital profiles in ways that falsely present non-existent individuals as real individuals. We are concerned about efforts to try to use our platforms to facilitate interactions with chatbots that are falsely presented as being interactions with a real person. We have concerns about creating output that is falsely attributed to non-existent authors or attributed to organizations that misstate or obfuscate their origins. And so there's a lot that goes into figuring out what is an appropriate use of these kinds of tools. And the general approach we've taken to it is that we need to tread carefully and start small and expand from there as people get used to the ways in which AI platforms are going to become a part of everyday life. We don't have to jump to the end state. We can kind of work our way there as we understand the use cases and the ways in which our platforms will be misused.
So a big motivation of this report, as you've described it, that they said quite expressly on the report, is transparency. The idea that information sharing is important in terms of being able to identify these actors, identify trends, identify what ChatGPT and other services that OpenAI provides are being used for. But of course, ChatGPT and OpenAI aren't the only actors out there. We're seeing an increasingly diverse sort of ecosystem of competitors in many ways, or parallel service providers doing similar types of things where some of these bad actors might go next. And so on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense for you all to say, here's what we're disclosing in terms of domain names you specifically identify, description of content, bad actors, things along those lines. The question I have is, do you think the level of transparency that's happening on the industry level is enough? And can you describe it for us? I mean, is there more transparency within the industry than what beyond these public documents we're seeing, which are only really describing the final stages of 5 pretty significant investigations, less sharing information in real time, which is an evolution we've seen in other industries like the social media industry, which gravitated towards a more collaborative model around certain issues, particularly terrorism recruitment and financing and hate speech. Are we seeing signs of that in the AI industry? And do you all think there's a need for that? Is there a desire for that, to see different actors and different competitors in other spaces collaborate in this one area where it seems kind of all the boats are rowing in the same direction?
I think information sharing is without a doubt a net positive. And it's one of the kind of core pillars of our investigations and disruptions work. And even hearkening back to our February announcement of disruptions related to sophisticated state actors, and also with respect to this report, we are sharing information with peer companies so that we can collectively better our defenses. Right? You're right that ultimately what the activity we see on our platforms is activity that may happen on other platforms as well. And so it's certainly important to share with peer AI companies. And it's also just as important to make sure that there is information sharing between the information creators and the content distributors. Because ultimately, the intent of how content is used is a really important piece of the equation, particularly when you think about influence operations. Being able to see that certain content is generated doesn't necessarily make it inauthentic until it is being distributed in a way that makes it inauthentic by false personas or organizations that are covering up their ultimate motives in spreading this kind of content. And so we need to be able to understand those kinds of indicators, ones that may not be available to us from the four corners of what we can see on our platform. And it's also important because ultimately our platforms are not the ones where this content is going to be distributed and liked and shared further with other third parties. And so we have to be able to collaborate with those kinds of content distributors to disrupt these networks before they reach a critical mass of followers.
So before we part, I want to take this conversation and bring it into another conversation we know is ongoing. That's the broader policy conversation, where AI has been a dominant issue at the national level, to some extent the international level, for the past year or two, and is likely to be for the foreseeable future. Does this experience that you all have had with these 5 cases point in the direction of legislative or administrative/regulatory measures that could be beneficial to the AI industry in trying to shut down some of this behavior or investigate it, to consumers trying to deal with the consequences of this? Are there directions where this is pointing? These experiences you're gathering and documenting for the first time are pointing for policymakers to grasp onto and say, yeah, okay, this helps us verify that particular set of measures could or would be useful if actually implemented at the policy level.
Scott, I think there's definitely a role for that kind of collaboration. We have been engaging with governments and other stakeholders to figure out how we can prevent abuse, how we can ensure transparency on AI-generated content, how we improve access to accurate voting information. I don't know that we have a concrete proposal or that I have one in mind about immediate steps that we need on the regulatory front. A lot of the bedrock that allows for the kind of information sharing we've been talking about largely already exists. And certainly government and policy stakeholders are a really important piece of the conversation as we think about a more holistic look at how do we disrupt these kinds of actors. Certainly putting my hat on as a former DOJ official and a former prosecutor, I would hope, I would expect that these groups are ones that the government has had their sights on, and I hope that we will see government disruptions, the kinds that private companies can't take, with respect to these actors, and that would certainly be one way to prevent them from coming back and making use of American technology for their ends. And so I guess that's what I would say on that. There's no doubt that is part of what we need to be doing. It's something that OpenAI has leaned into, and it's something that not just we but others have leaned into as well. The monitoring for abuse, the kinds of the safety work that these investigations feed into, these are part of what OpenAI and peer companies have committed to as part of the voluntary commitments that we made in 2023. Many of those were reaffirmed at the most recent Seoul Safety Summit that occurred. And so there's a really robust debate, or I should say a really robust dialogue around how we can kind of work together to make AI systems safer, including in the context of abuse by sophisticated threat actors.
Well, we will have to leave the topic there for now, although we may have more reports and more events to bring us together to talk about it again. Until then, Alex, thank you for joining us again here on the Lawfare podcast.
Thank you for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website at lawfaremedia.org/support. You also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. And be sure to check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. This podcast is edited by Jem Pacha, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.